Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. How bewilderingly old-fashioned, perhaps worse that sounds, at a time when a BBC Schools video tells 9-year-olds that it's really, really exciting. There are 100 genders, if not more now. Gender is the new social battlefield, where minorities who see themselves with some justification as having been marginalised and discriminated against are not only fighting the normative majority, but increasingly with each other. 2 of the 3 Labour leadership candidates have waded into this increasingly venomous cultural civil war. They've pledged themselves to a transgender manifesto that labels named women's and gay rights organisations trans-exclusionary hate groups. The manifesto insists that trans women are women and trans men are men. A refusal to accept this fundamental aspect of their perceived identity, or even attempts to discuss it, are explicitly or implicitly regarded as hateful, bigotry in this case meriting expulsion from the party. The main women's group involved says it's only concerned with protecting hard-won women's rights, particularly female changing rooms, refuges, prisons, which could, and in many cases already are, open to male-bodied people, some even with records of sexual offences. There are other issues for those who do want to debate the moral implications of gender self-identification. Can biology be a matter of opinion? Is it morally right or even scientifically tenable to make an absolute distinction between sex and gender? The one objective, assigned at birth, the other subjective, a matter entirely of feelings and individual self-perception. Where does masculinity end and femininity begin? What constitutes transphobia? Most worrying for many, what's behind the huge increase in sometimes very young children, mostly girls, mostly identifying as gay boys, who say they want to change gender, and how should they be treated? That's our moral maze tonight. The panel: Anne McElvoy, senior editor at The Economist, the former Conservative Cabinet Minister Michael Portillo, Mona Siddiqui, Professor of Islamic and Interreligious Studies at Edinburgh University, and new to the panel, the Reverend Canon Rachel Mann, who, more to the point in this context, a trans woman. Just to be clear, raised as a boy.
Absolutely.
Do you regard those who think you are not a real woman as bigoted?
Bigoted is not a word I would use. Let's just say I would hope with a little more conversation and information, they might be a little more generous.
Anne McElvoy?
I think this is such a fascinating and sometimes troubling subject, which we do tend to approach a bit with trepidation. I'm very pleased that we're talking about on the show tonight, because it's an area where liberal and progressive rights often come into conflict with each other around something, gender in this case, which is already difficult to define and sometimes slippery. So we also have a bit of an exploratory programme, I think, as well as a maze before us.
Mona Siddiqui.
I think words like bigoted don't actually open up any kind of discussion. They're closed discussions. So let's try and move away from that. This is a very sensitive, very topical subject. And I think that it's great that the Maze is actually doing this.
Michael Portillo.
A trans woman, Debbie Hayton, recently wrote, "I believe trans women are male and women are female. Male people are not female people, and therefore trans women are not women." I think that's my starting point, but I'm all ears.
Panel, thanks very much indeed. Our first witness is Torr Robinson, who's chair of the Labour campaign for trans rights, who drew up this manifesto. You describe yourself as gender non-conforming. Does that mean you're transitioning out of one gender but not actually, or not yet, into another?
Well, the term I use for myself is non-binary.
Right.
But yes, that's, I suppose, essentially correct, yeah.
OK. Michael Portillo.
Is a trans woman a woman?
Yes.
And that must mean that you know what a woman is. Can you define a woman for us?
Can you define a woman?
Yes, I think I can. I mean, I'm not a medically qualified, but I would talk about sexual organs and so on. Yes, I think I can. Do you define a woman?
I would define a woman based on if somebody lives as a woman, if somebody has the experiences of a woman, then I think that is the most accurate starting point for saying that they are in fact a woman.
So, I mean, really, that trumps biology.
Well, what does biology mean in this context? I mean, sex is a very complicated thing. There's multiple different aspects of sex, and they aren't always in a simple alignment. There's not just two sort of simple, always aligned forms of sexual configuration. that these sexual characteristics can be changed, and they do indeed change.
But you might by now have lost quite a lot of people, because I think for the majority of people, the question, can you define a man or can you define a woman, is absurd, because they think, of course they can. So isn't that a problem, that you may well have lost half the audience by now, or that's more?
I think it's a problem that I think the more of an issue is that if you have a definition here that you've given to me, which excludes the experiences of a significant proportion of people, if that's the case, then the definition you've given is an academic one. It's not fit for purpose in reality.
And you really believe, do you, that people should be left freely to define their own gender as a matter of law? I mean, you don't think this should be policed in any way? No,
not at all. I think it's frankly a slightly absurd proposition that the state should decide what gender you are. Gender is a relatively personal relationship, and it has a social dimension to it. But it's a personal thing. I think it's absurd to say the state should be investigating people's bodies and minds and behaviours for this.
Well, it's really the mind you're worried about, isn't it? But, I mean, do you see no dangers in this? I mean, do you not think that, for example, bad men might be inclined to define themselves as women in the way that in the past teaching and the priesthood have attracted paedophiles?
I think, firstly, it's deeply prejudicial to compare trans people to paedophiles.
No, I wasn't. I was saying that bad people, under your proposal, people can define their gender without any policing whatsoever. I've just asked you to consider the practical consequences of that. Could that not attract bad people to define themselves as women? Remember that you're not policing it in any way at all.
I think you have, in the spaces in which this is talked about, you already have protocols in place to deal with these things, in places like prisons or indeed women's refuges. If someone goes into a space like that and behaves or acts in a way that is in some way harmful, then there should be protocols in place already to deal with those things. I don't think it's really, and furthermore, if a man seeks to do harm to women, they will probably do so without bothering to go through the process of a transition.
Sorry,
go ahead.
Emma Gilbert?
Isn't the most difficult part of the self-identification argument not so much about people being able to live in the way that they choose and feel that they should be living, that the existence is you put it yourself, that they feel that they are entitled to live and to be respected for, but where that then leads to a clash of rights, which we alluded to at the top of the programme, and the very obvious one is in women-only spaces, which is a set of rights. It's enshrined in law. It's a rights-based argument going back centuries about women being able to be in one space. It gets more complicated when self-identification enters the picture.
I think there's 2 points to make on here. Firstly, in British law as it stands, that there is not, in fact, a distinction between your legal sex and your legal gender. If you have a gender recognition certificate, you are regarded as the sex that it deems you to be. So in this regard, I think the question of a conflict between trans people's rights and women's rights already isn't in play in reality. Furthermore, in practice, self-identification is used in many other countries without the consequences that I think people imagine quite wrongly it would have. And furthermore, I think what this really tends to be posed as...
It depends how many rights follow from it and where they clash with other people's perceived rights in any country.
I think... Well, firstly, the real question here is, do trans women's rights conflict with cis women's rights? And I think that there's no basis for that.
But you see, a lot of people disagree with you, including some groups, Women's Alliance and other groups where you've been very vocal against them and referred to them as hate groups. Now, they do disagree with you. They have a thought-through position. You have your thought-through position. Why go into this stance of flinging about accusations of hate or hatred, of transphobia, not simply saying you don't understand me and I want you to listen to me and change your mind? Why go into this quite extreme position?
I think it's right to describe any organisation which was founded for the purpose of and exists for the purpose of limiting the rights of a marginalised group as a bigoted one.
But it is the rights of an existing group who also feel themselves to be marginalised. That is the clash of rights here.
But that assumes that these groups actually do represent cis women. I don't think that's actually the case, to be honest. I think these are quite small groups which don't represent the majority of people's opinion. And ultimately, it would be quite absurd if they did, because trans people we're a significant...
Well, so trans people have different views to yours as well, so we can just assume all our coalitions are a little bit ragged at the edges, right? Would you
I mean, we can, but I do think it matters if you're speaking for a broad swathe of the majority.
Once you've got so sectarian, you end up in a position where you have an argument with some radical feminists, with liberals, with centralists. So you start out as a broad and progressive coalition. Do you not worry that it narrows inwards and becomes a bit of a sort of sectarian identity politics argument?
No, because I think firstly, the concerns, the issues, the material issues trans people have are shared with many other people. The biggest issues we have are the fact that in some areas the waiting time for trans healthcare is up to 4 years, and that's because of NHS underfunding. We have a massive crisis of homelessness, a massive crisis of unemployment in our community, a massive mental health crisis because of the effects of transphobia and of these problems. These are issues that are shared with the working class and with many other groups. I don't think this is a sectarian concern. I think, furthermore, the fact that we've shown there is this broad base of support in the Labour Party and amongst the Labour leadership contenders shows that this isn't a fringe sort of concern. This is something that matters.
Torr Robinson, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for having me on.
Our next witness is Kiri Tunks, who's co-founder of A Woman's Place UK, a group that campaigns, they say, for the principle of women-only spaces to be upheld and, where necessary, extended. Well, Labour's transgender manifesto and, by extension, 2 out of 3 of the leadership candidates for the Labour Party reckon you're a hate group.
Well, we're clearly not a hate group. We're a group that has been set up to campaign for women's rights as they already exist in law, and that's all we've been set up to do. The other thing we were set up to do was to make sure that women's voices were heard in a consultation about a law change that we think would have affected them or will affect them.
Mona Siddiqui?
Kiri, what's your biggest fear that you feel the need to protect women's spaces?
Well, I think what's been interesting about this campaign is that during the course of making sure that women's voices were heard on the GRA, we became aware actually of the paucity of women's rights in this country, and the rights that we thought we had won actually are really under threat or don't exist in the way that we thought. We thought we were confident about the rights we had, but we have found that a lot of women don't feel that they have those rights in reality.
But specifically to do, women don't have lots of rights in all kinds of areas, but I'm talking about specifically against the safe space that you want away from trans women. Why do you need to protect that space? What's your biggest fear against them?
Women's oppression is real, and women's oppression is recognised in law. That's why in the equality law, there are provisions to make sure that women can ameliorate the discrimination and the oppression they face. So the single-sex exemptions exist to enable women to create safe spaces to recover from trauma, from male violence, and so on.
Yeah.
So those are the things that we are concerned about. That if you have a self-ID situation, you start to lose that boundary. Mm-hmm. If you can't define what a woman is, how can you defend women's rights?
That's true, but there's not... I mean, where's the evidence to... I mean, most violence against women are by heterosexual men, not by trans women. There's no real evidence to show that trans women are a real threat to women's spaces, is there?
Well, that's not what we're saying. What we're saying is
But that's what you're trying to protect
Well,
from.
no, what we're saying is that if you have a law which allows self-identification, first of all, you say that the class of being a woman doesn't matter anymore and that anybody can identify as being a woman. Therefore, how can you uphold the boundaries that the law has put in place for women to protect themselves? So in answer to your question about male violence, we know that the violence and abuse that women face, is the majority of that comes from men.
Yeah,
okay?
but
not
that's
all
my
men.
whole point.
Yeah, not all men, but men, and so therefore those boundaries are in place. There is no evidence to suggest that trans women have a different pattern of criminality. So for us, it's a simple situation of saying that we can't tell, so we would like to preserve our boundaries.
So a lot of this is you're protecting, you're kind of almost preempting something that might never happen because you are feeling... Well, let me get to this, because you're focused on protecting your rights, hard-won rights, I acknowledge. But what about the rights of those people who are already feeling very vulnerable and feel they have no place where they can call home?
Well, that's wrong, isn't it? That's wrong. We absolutely want trans people to have rights.
Yeah, but how would you square that circle?
Well, I'm not sure what circle you're asking me to square. Women have the right to have single-sex exemptions where they can be just women on their own. And we think that the way to deal with the threats to other groups is to make sure that those groups have spaces that they feel safe in.
So
you don't necessarily
where would trans women go go then?
Well,
if let's just say there are 2 rooms, one for men, one for women, whether it's a toilet or whatever, and there are trans men and trans women, where would they belong?
That's a very limited approach. That is saying that we have to organise ourselves like that. I don't want us to organise ourselves like that. We want to organise society in a way that meets everybody's needs.
Rachel Mann?
Kiri, I just want to take this back a step. You're on the record as saying, why is it always women who are expected to be nice and accommodate men's demands? Now, given that it's evident that large numbers of women, the main LGBT groups, younger people, indeed the vast majority of people aren't up in arms about trans people, who exactly is covered by this term woman, in your view?
So the law is quite clear on what a woman is. In the Equality Act, there are 9 protected characteristics, and sex is one of those. Another protected characteristic is gender reassignment. So the law makes a distinction between women, biological women, and trans women. And I think that is the thing that women are wanting to protect. They want to uphold the political and social protections that they have to ameliorate their oppression.
But don't you think you've got a rather reductionist idea about what a woman is? Biological? I mean, I'm looking at you now, and I'm not judging you by genetic criteria. I'm actually just encountering you as a woman, as I hope you're encountering me as a woman.
I'm glad you're not judging me. I mean, the question is whether women can organise for their own rights and so on, okay? And that is upheld in law. We have the single-sex exemptions that allow us to do that. I think that if we start saying that anybody can self-identify as a woman, then we start removing the boundaries that women want that help them make sense of their lives and protect themselves from the oppressions that they face.
So is the implication of your position that those who support trans women, trans people in their self-identification, which include many non-trans women, non-trans lesbians, LGBT people, that they're actually kind of dupes? That they've bought into something ridiculous?
I don't think that. We don't have that opinion that we think people are ridiculous. What we think is that this issue hasn't been properly explored. We think many people haven't fully considered the impact of this change to the law. And you say many people, the majority of, I don't know what you're basing that on. I don't know what your evidence base is for that. So I think we actually don't know what people think. I think the vast majority of the public, not on social media, are maybe not fully informed with all the arguments. And that's what Women's Place has always asked for. We've always asked for respectful, polite debate. And we've been shut down and harassed for trying to get it.
And very finally, the government are on record at saying that if self-ID is permitted, there will be no change to the provision to women-only spaces and services under the Equality Act 2010. So actually, to what extent is your campaign a surrogate for something else, a proxy war?
Well, first of all, we're not naive enough to believe what politicians tell us. Secondly, we know that there are a huge number of lobbying groups who are calling for an end to the single-sex exemptions, the removal of them. For example, Stonewall, Gendered Intelligence, Scottish Trans Alliance are all calling for the removal of the single-sex exemption. So it's not a surrogate campaign, it's a real campaign. Women are very worried about it, and we're going to fight to keep those rights.
Kiri Tunks, thanks very much indeed. Our next witness is Jane Fae, who's Secretary of Transmedia Watch, campaigner for trans rights. Describes herself as a writer, occasional comic and professional nuisance. You're on the right programme.
Thank you.
You're a trans woman. What do you say to those who may sympathise totally with your feelings, celebrate your bravery in dealing with them, but think biology is not a matter of opinion and you can never be a real woman?
They are welcome to those views. That's not an issue for me.
But what do you say to them?
Well, it depends what they're saying to me. I mean, if they're in my face screaming about it, I've had one of those in the last year who proclaimed on social media they would turn up at my doorstep and rip my junk off. I'm sorry if I'm a bit rude there, and I thought, oh dear, you're a bit late for that. And were I to meet that person, I probably wouldn't say much to them. I'd just call the police. But if it was some... Sorry.
OK.
Got the message.
Yes, indeed.
Anne McElvoy.
Yes. When we now talk about gender dysphoria, I think the point that worries a lot of people is how do you then assess self-identification when it comes to young people and children who are below the age at which a lot of moral and legal arguments are sort of left to us to decide as adults. Your solution, if I put it that way, is affirmative care. Could you just explain what that is?
Affirmative care is to support the young person in what they are trying to do at the time that they're trying to do it. And that does not mean just going, OK, you want this, we're going to give it to you. It means giving them the sense that they are supported. And certainly the feedback I've had from parents of trans children is that where there is affirmative care, it actually reduces the pressure on the child to push ahead with some sort of transition. But the idea that affirmative care means we're going to go straight into some sort of transition, no. What Sorry.
So sorry. If you don't mind, I might just ask
you
a question.
No.
It does. I
Absolutely.
think it's going to where you're going. So the large number, the much larger number of young people beginning treatment or transitioning, also through clinical intervention, medical intervention.
Yes.
Do you think that is simply due to the fact that they didn't know about it before, it wasn't available before that? So it's a simple correlation. Am I right? Sorry.
I'm going to go there, and I'm going to give you some other figures as well, because it goes to something you came up with in the earlier segment. I transitioned late. I wish I had known. And I really, really didn't know. When I was young, and I shan't take a stab at the ages of people around this table, but when I was young, trans was sort of something that vicars did with someone else's vests in their pantry, or pants in someone else's vestry, when whatever. It was a Sunday tabloid freak show sort of thing. What we're seeing right now, and the ONS has helpfully reported on this, is that LGB has spiked over the last, so not trans, but that has spiked over the last 5 years. The biggest growth area is lesbian women, and it's for young lesbian women. And all that you're seeing right now is a catch-up in the trans area.
But that may be true in terms of taking the ONS statistics as reasonably reliable, although people often argue about statistics of any kind in this area, as you know. The difficulty will be surely because you need to make early interventions, often delaying puberty in order for the person. If this person is so sure at an early age that they really want to go along this route, so you'd support them. Do you see any danger there that you have a bit of a suppressed premise because you've had your own experience, you have had the life that you have had? To what extent do we have to be cautious, however strongly we may feel about our own identity, when it's something that has direct consequences for very young people?
What happens with puberty blockers is that puberty is put on pause. The best available evidence suggests that after that pause, people can resume if that is not for them. Now,
there are those in the medical community who think that you need a lot more data over a long time.
Well, that is true, and I know Professor Winston, has said that, but he doesn't say that of other drugs. He only says of this, and like ibuprofen. What I would say back to you is, if you're going to say, oh no, have your puberty, then I'd like you to be there when that trans youngster has to go through extensive and massive facial surgeries and other surgeries because you didn't give them a chance to be trans earlier.
Michael Bottillo.
Is there paradoxically a danger here that you are going to reinforce stereotypes? I mean, there's nothing wrong with being an effeminate boy, a masculine woman,
absolutely,
being a gay boy or a lesbian
wrong.
Girl, but is there not a tendency that you're going to push those people towards gender reassignment?
No. I mean, people get things wrong in every single walk of life. And we have this debate right now about trans regret or people making mistakes and so on. But we allow people to make mistakes in things like termination of life. That sort of thing is allowed. Certainly the idea, and if you meet trans children, you will not see tomboys, you will not see boys wearing dresses. You will see people with an absolute determination as to their gender, and that comes from a very early age. Now, I'm not saying that it's certain, and that's why you go affirmative. Affirmative is not saying we accept that you are this. It is saying we support you in what you maintain you are, and we give you the space and the time in order to decide who you are.
Well, one of the things that's worrying a lot of people is the way some, it appears, seek to close down the debate. So, for instance, if I question whether people should be allowed by law to self-identify, does that make me transphobic?
Nope. No, not at all.
Have you ever come across anyone who might think that it did?
Yes, I have.
Right. But it's not your opinion.
It's part of the problem, and I don't know if you got my... your producer said it was an excellent piece in The Independent today, so I shall go with that. The problem...
Self-promotion's one of your skills.
Absolutely.
About on the show.
Oh, I've got a book next year. I hope to be back for that.
I'll make a note.
And now I've lost the point I was going to say.
Right, can I ask you another question?
Oh, all right.
It's the same thing in a way.
Derailed by the railway person.
If I say that both man and woman are definable terms,
Yes.
does that make me transphobic?
I'd say it makes you not very relevant, because I'm interesting. That is the point that you started off on with the first guest. Women's spaces are social spaces. Therefore, they are spaces defined by society and by politics. You, as a former politician, will know the Interpretation Act, which starts out by saying that in this act, as it the singular implies the plural and vice versa, and the masculine implies feminine and vice versa. What I'm interested in is rights for trans people and protections and safety for non-trans people. And in my case, it's women, but that may also apply to men. So I'm interested in the pragmatics, and frankly, getting bogged down in definitions doesn't help us one way or the other. The point is, there are trans people around, there are trans women, there are not very many of us, and we have, as a society, to make space for us.
Jane Fae, thanks very much indeed. Our last witness is Graham Linehan, who's a comedian and scriptwriter, one of the creators of the television series Father Ted. He's on the line now from Norwich, and in a recent article he described himself as the most hated man on the internet. Graham, why are you hated?
Well, I guess because I've got a big platform and I've been railing about this stuff for the last 2 years. That's essentially it.
All right, I'm sure you'll unpack that for us. Rachel Mann.
Graham, in a recent Newsnight interview, you compared the prescription of puberty blockers to children to Nazi eugenics programs. How much do you regret saying that, amongst many other things?
I don't regret hardly anything I've said. I do regret that because I was kind of surprised by the hostile nature of the interview, so I decided to steer into what was originally a comment about feeling that, I was kind of proud of myself that I kept my integrity at what I believe is a hinge moment in history. And
integrity about Nazi eugenics programs?
No, you keep bringing that up to try and distract from what I'm saying, so I'll just continue with my point. I think that there are certain problems that are reminiscent of things in the past, and how are we supposed to learn from the past if we don't address them? And one thing that I have seen is in the Tavistock, some of the whistleblowers who've come out of the Tavistock, which is the main gender clinic.
It's the NHS transgender clinics.
And Graham, I recognise that there are a range... Sorry, Graham, let me just ask another question.
No, I'll just finish my point. I'll just very quickly finish my point. What they have said is there was a dark joke going on around the Tavistock that soon there would be no gay people left. Now, that's a very serious thing. And what confuses me about this issue is that while I rightly got in trouble for using hyperbolic language, I do not know how to pronounce that, I do wonder why this isn't seen as more vital and more important a discussion than it is.
OK, you've talked about how proper transsexuals, you use that phrase, need love and compassion. Now, let's suppose for a moment...
I'm not sure, did I use the word proper?
I think you did in your briefing. Now, let's suppose I am one of those proper ones. How should I feel about that statement?
Well, I'm not sure. I really can't remember using the word proper. It seems like an odd word for me to use because I tend to avoid language like that because I know how it can be leaped on. But I'll give you one of my main. I'll answer in a different way if that's okay. One of my main problems with this whole discussion is that the word transgender has replaced the word transsexual, and I think people think when they defend trans rights, they think they're defending transsexual rights, but of course they're not. They're defending a whole range of things that falls under Stonewall Wall's umbrella, which includes cross-dressers. So when people say that trans women are women, they are saying that, you know, a cross-dresser like Pippa Bunce, who dresses as a woman 2 days out of the week, is the same sex as my wife and daughter. Now, the thing about that is I can't accept that, and I never will, you know, and there has to be a little bit of respect to our position on that.
But can we just push back about on boundaries? To what extent does the kind of position you advocate keep trans people as either oddities and curiosities, or require them to see themselves as pathological, sad, shameful beings?
Well, I think that's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy if they continue to deny reality. Like, I'm friends with, one of the ironies of my situation is that I'm friends with many trans people now. Debbie Hayton, Fionn Norlander, Christina Harrison. Christina Harrison spoke at a Woman's Place event and did a very moving speech about it. And they are all of the opinion that they are male. And they're of the opinion that they have dysphoria. And they want to try and live in a way that's where they can present in a feminine way without disturbing or getting in the way of women's rights. What I find poisonous is this argument that women have to move over and make room for really what is a male problem. You know, trans women should not feel unwelcome in male spaces, and that's what I always say about Debbie and Christina. You know, they're my brothers.
Mona Siddiqui?
Graham, do you think that trans people are, I mean, you said this in your briefing, are really just going through some kind of silly phase? It's all nonsense.
No, where was this briefing?
You have said this. Well, what do you think then? What do you think? Is it a phase or is it something?
No, again, I don't really know what the word trans means. Look, my feeling is that there are people who suffer from gender dysphoria and they have to be given as much help and medical help and rights as everyone else. But what trans women can't have is women's rights, you know?
Okay.
So you know, I just think that the way to address it is to take a rational, fact-based look at it. And, you know, if we do that, we won't have situations like Karen White getting into a female prison, you know?
But,
I mean, it still boggles my mind that a male sex offender got into a women's prison, was able to assault four women.
I mean,
that's where this kind of muddy thinking leads us.
Yes, but I mean, the point is that this whole debate is very complex and it's very sensitive, and it will continue to be complex. There can't really be any hard and fast rules. And one of the things that you've just said I want to pick up on is that if only women are females, what name do we give to men who are suffering body dysphoria?
Well, whatever name you like, is just the word women is taken.
But if they see themselves, if they identify themselves as women, who are we, you and I, who may be very confident in our own sexuality, to say, well, no, actually, your anguish doesn't deserve that particular designation? Well,
it's one of these things where, you know, my instinct at the moment is the anguish of, or my protective instinct comes out when it comes to the anguish of women who are suddenly don't feel safe in spaces that are supposed to be safe. The best example of this is Vancouver Rape Relief, which was defunded by a trans woman called Morgane Ogre in Canada, and they're still kept going through contributions, and they had a dead rat nailed to their door. I mean, this is a rape crisis centre, you know. So I agree that their anguish is something we really need to talk about and we really need to come up with solutions about. But what's happening at the moment is there's a complete, and I'm sure you've noticed this even in preparing for this programme, there is a complete shutdown of conversation, because once you get these points out there, no one can argue with them.
Graham Linehan, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
So, there are a number of things to go for here, aren't there, to discuss that we've heard. Torr Robinson, our first witness. I mean, a lot of it was to do with definitions, isn't it? And their definition was, if you live as a woman, they are a woman. Michael, you seemed rather unimpressed by this at the time.
Yes, I don't think that will do as a legal position. I thought when I presented Torr with some of the consequences, the reply was not particularly well thought through, it seemed to me. Said, well, that there'll be protocols in prisons. But I think we weren't just talking about that. We were talking about a very different situation from what we have today, where you simply declare your gender to be what you say it to be. And I didn't feel that those implications have been thought through. And I think there is a lot of thinking to be done. And so I was also very worried that Torr says of the Woman's Place organisation that since it's trying to constrain the rights of others, it's right to describe it as a hate organisation. We then went on, of course, to hear that in its view, it's not trying to constrain the rights of others, it's trying to defend the rights of women.
Rachel, on this basis of definition, I mean, you must have an informed view.
Well, I have a take, and my take is this, that definitions always leave things out. I'm much more interested in another philosophical idea, which is family resemblance. So there are lots of ways in which my story is different to Anne's or Mona's, but actually we do have a family resemblance sufficient that it's okay for me to be identified as a woman. And I think that's partly because of the way in which I'm treated in this society, actually. I am a woman.
Anne, the definition business?
I think there's a challenge to that, which is that might be true as we feel, as any of us speaking feels it ourselves. It's what follows from that is where I think things get much more contested, which I think was where we got to with the first witness. And for some people saying, well, I'm a woman, I'm a trans woman, and that's it, you know, like it all on, but misses out the sort of extraordinary biological journey of women who are born women, natal women, as you might put it. Now, I don't think it excludes rights for trans women, but I think you could see that many people would say that there might be some differences that follow from it, and they're particularly then about when rights and entitlements clash. So I think you're being very nice, Rachel. I think that it gets difficult in the areas where there is competition of beliefs.
Mona, the reason I was dwelling for a time on the idea of defining, in this particular case, a woman was possibly because of the second witness, Kiri Tunks from the women's group there, who said, I thought, and it resonated with me, if you can't actually define what a woman is, how can you defend women's rights? Did that have any impact on you?
Well, she's defending women's rights on the grounds that she can define what a woman is. So I'm not really sure I follow that. I think that to me, the gap in this discussion, I think with all of them was, well, once you've decided who can own what term to define themselves, and the other side says, no, you can't, or as our last witness, that term's already taken. Where do these people go? How do we address them? Beyond the they and them, how do we actually address them? And Kiri didn't say, she said, I want rights for everyone, but rights are lived realities. You have to make physical space for people. You have to give them ownership. It isn't just an abstract thought. And I don't think she had an answer to that. She said, no, we want everyone to have rights, and that somehow we're reducing it if we're just looking at spaces. But spaces are really important to how people feel about themselves and how they're viewed.
Michael, those first two witnesses, the first witness thought that trans women didn't represent any potential danger to women's refuges or prisons, yes, or whatever. Whereas Kiri Tunks, Kiri Tunks continued to define them as men, and she also defines men as a potential threat. So there's a disjunction there.
I want to go back on the question you asked Mona, because I thought Mona dismissed it straight away. What Kiri was talking about was if the law were changed in the way that Torr wants it to be, so that you self-defined, then there would not be a definition of women, except as people define themselves. Therefore, I think it's a perfectly logical point to say you could not protect women's rights in that situation. She also said, and I think this is clear from the Labour leadership debate, that for holding the view that she holds, she and her organisation have been shut down and harassed. And, I mean, that is really very worrying. And it makes one believe that this is a pretty intolerant ideology that's emerging in places. And And that's important, I think, for everything that follows, not least how we behave towards our children.
Rachel, in your conversation with Kiri Tunks towards the end, you suggested the idea that this was some sort of proxy war. What do you actually mean by that? I
think what I mean by that is that as someone who spent a great deal of time in feminist circles, as a feminist scholar, I'm conscious that this debate has a history, and it goes back at least to second wave feminism in the 70s, in which actually those people who don't fit very particular narratives of what a woman is tend to get thrown out and thrown off the bus. And that might be to do with non-trans women who are very feminine, but equally it might be trans women who disrupt ideas of what a woman is. So I'm worried that there is actually further stories behind there.
I think that's very true, and I think it's something it causes sort of progressivism to have to interrogate itself more. This is not simply the old divide between progressives and social conservatives. It's am I allowed to go on?
No,
you shoving me off? Such authoritarianism.
I know. I wanted to get on to this question of children. I mean, the much larger numbers of children who are presenting with dysphoria, gender dysphoria, and so on. What did we make of the second two witnesses? Jane Fae thought that puberty blockers, for instance, were useful. The affirmative care puberty blockers were useful as a pause to take a look at this. Did you go along with that, Mona?
I have to own up that I don't know enough about this in the sense that my concern is at what age do we start taking children's sense of themselves seriously? And that's a really difficult question, I think, in terms of gender and gender dysphoria. I'm not sure that I think puberty blocking is a good idea. It depends on the age of the child as well, because children's lives are in such flux on so many levels. But I think that the issue is that we're taking sides on this in this debate, not us as a group, but the whole debate is about which side are you on? And actually there has to be some consensus about how we discuss this with a bit more knowledge and a bit more compassion when it comes to kids.
Our last witness had described this elsewhere as Nazi eugenics, which seems something of an overstatement, but do you have worries about it?
Yeah, I mean, it's always a kind of bad thing, I think, dragging the Nazis into things that are, when they're not about that. I can see where his argument is headed. I think that was an overstatement. And in fairness, I think Mr. Linehan sort of said to himself he got a bit carried away with that one, but he has a very strong position. He clearly believes that people are being prodded along a line. Now, there's very much a case here where it is possible that both things are true at once. That some people, and I think probably Jane Fae was in this category, are playing down some things that might be more serious than they want to acknowledge, and at the same time there's an overreaction from our last witness. OK, well, we're going to have to leave it there. It's been a fascinating discussion on every level, I think. That's it for this week from our panel, Michael Portillo, Rachel Mann, Anne McElvoy and Mona Siddiqui. And from me, until the same time next week, goodbye.